Alright, so the whole basic principle of float fishing is what you're trying to do is you're trying to present the bait to the fish first, like I was explaining. And how you do that is you have to slow down your float to the subsurface current speed. So when everybody gets into this whole thing, they think that using a bobber is to try to match the speed of the surface current. So you're casting it out there and you're just letting it cruise, and that's going to be able to cover the most amount of water, and it's going to be able to you know, cover the fish properly. But the real reason that it's so effective is you're actually slowing the bait down to the subsurface current where the fish are. So you have the surface current, which is typically moving a half mile quicker, and you're basically, you know, all the way to a mile quicker, and you're trying to the whole time just slow down your rig the whole entire time. So that's why a center pin or a bait caster is pretty much your best bet. Sorry, I'm a little nervous. This is the first seminar I've done so far. So. So like center pin's obviously going to be the best way to cover these fish, but another way you can do it is also with a bait caster. And the reason that a bait caster is so effective is the same reason a center pin is. Sorry. So with a bait caster, you could pretty much just lock the bait caster in free spool and thumb the spool, and you're able to slow your float down to bring the bait up in front of the fish, just like this. So like I said, you never want to just cast it out and let it cruise at the speed of the current, because then you're passing by where the fish are actually sitting. What you want to do is actually slow down your bait and thumb the spool, and that's where a center pin gets way more effective. If you're going to use a spinning reel and that's your only means, the best thing to do is to really try to control the line as it's coming off and try to hold it with your hand to slow the reel down, but you're going to get a massive amount of line twist the whole time. It's really difficult to do. So there's like various shot patterns and stuff you could do below your float to present the bait depending on the conditions that you're fishing. So if you look on the back of that blood run flyer, you'll see all the different shot patterns and everything, and the whole deal is to try to get that bait in front of the fish before they see all the terminal tackle and stuff. So there's a couple different types of line you can use. The best possible line out there by far is Blood Run. That's the company that's sponsoring this whole seminar. They make a floating monofilament that will pretty much sit right at the surface of the current the whole time, or sit right subsurface to the current in certain conditions, where when you lift up on your float, you immediately connect to the fish. So that's why you always want to try to find a floating monofilament, so it kind of sits right on the water. And then it's almost like fly fishing, where you're mending it to stay tight to your float the whole time. So there's kind of a controversial thing about using high vis versus low vis, and it's kind of all personal preference. You know, we sell more high vis line than low vis line. Now, personally, I like the low vis. The high vis line helps you kind of guide to see where your float's drifting, but the low vis line, when you're fighting a fish, the fish isn't zipping around through all the other fish with a high vis line, so that's not spooking them. So that's kind of why I feel it's more effective. Let's see what else I can show you guys. Do you have any questions for me? Anything to work off? You guys want to know anything?
A couple questions. Is the current right direction on that?
Yep. So the current's going this way in this direction. The fish are facing up current always, you know, unless they're dropping back down, which when they're dropping down, they're, you know, dropping down a little bit and then they're turning back around. So you always want to have your float facing up towards you as it's drifting down. So as your float's drifting down, I can kind of show you guys right here.
So you're saying the bottom current is faster than the top current?
No, the top current is way faster than the bottom current. So the whole idea about with the float fishing is you're trying to present the bait at the subsurface current. That's what you're trying to do. That's the whole goal of it. That's why a center pin or a bait caster is so effective.
But with your thumb, you're actually holding that float and your top line back.
You're holding it back. So as this is
swings out.
as this is drifting, pretty much what's happening is because you have a tapered shot line. You always want your heaviest shot right below your float, and you want to taper it from heaviest all the way down to lightest, which is closest to your egg sac or your soft plastic or your jig, and that's the point of least resistance. That's going to be your smallest split shot right there. So as it's drifting, you're slowly applying a little bit of pressure to basically slow your float down to the subsurface current. So your float's kind of angled like this the whole time as it's drifting down. And what it's doing is every time you put pressure on it, you're able to rise your bait either higher or lower based off where that's going to go. So the more pressure you put, the more your float's going to angle up towards you and the more your bait's going to swing up. So if you have fish that are sitting at the bottom, what you can do is apply less pressure. You always want to apply some pressure, but you want your float to be riding pretty much always facing towards you the whole entire time as it's drifting up. So the bait's leading the way. That's why you have all these different tapered
Is it
shots.
kind of trial and error, or is really looking at the float kind of the key, right?
Yeah, you're kind of following the float the whole time. And like I fished, a 3-foot leader and a 2-foot run, and just by applying a certain amount of pressure, I'm able to raise that bait up just by, you gotta figure if it's tapered and the point of least resistance is closest to your bait, when you hold back on that, your bait's gonna swing up and go like this the whole time. And as you drop it, it's gonna go like this.
Yeah. So if you see a horizontal float, you got too much top pressure.
Exactly. So you don't ever want it sitting straight up and down unless you're fishing frog water, but I always keep like a slight little bit of an angle towards myself as it's drifting. So this is kind of like ideal, but what's so cool is you can cover so many different columns of water just by holding back on your spool. So that's why a spinning reel isn't nearly as effective as a center pin or a bait caster, because it's hard to apply the pressure to it. So like, I'll get back to a spinning reel really quick. What stage are most of you guys at right now? At a spinning reel, center pin, bait caster?
I got doing very well.
All of them.
Okay. All right. Well,
It's all good.
They all kind of have their place. So yeah. So anyways, like I was kind of saying in the beginning, this just becomes really difficult because what happens is, you have to worry about so many things going on when you're using a spinning reel. So you're casting out, you're drifting, you're worrying about holding your float back. As if that's not enough, once your float actually drops, you have to worry about setting the hook. So what you have to do is you have to flip the bail down, pull up on the line as you're trying to control your float to hold it back. So it makes it very difficult. There's a lot of different things going on when you're using a spinning reel. Plus you're creating a massive amount of line twist every time this is coming off. So something that has a free spinning spool like a bait caster or a center pin is going to be far more effective. The only downside to a center pin, which you can still do it, it's just more difficult, is you're kind of limited. You can't throw lures and you can't throw different crankbaits and stuff like that if the water isn't moving super fast. Like I've caught all kinds of fish throwing spoons and quick fish and stuff like that on my center pin, playing around to see if I could do it, but it's definitely more difficult to do rather than having a reel that's got some sort of gear ratio. So the downside to a center pin is it's a 1-to-1 gear ratio and you can't use lures. It's not as versatile as a bait caster. I still think it's the optimal thing to use in a float fishing situation because it's more intimate. It's just you and the fish. But a bait caster definitely rivals second to a center pin. So we go from a spinning reel to a bait caster. That's what secondly guys are most familiar with. So like I said, this has a free spinning free spinning spool just like a center pin. And the cool thing about this is while the line's going out and drifting, you're able just to thumb this like so. So if you're not comfortable, if a lot of us are brought up using spinning reels where we're always reeling left-handed, and then you go and look for a left-handed bait casting reel, they're hard to find, but they're out there. So if you want to start off with a bait caster rather than before going to a center pin, it's a good option. You just try to find one that's comfortable for you. Your strong arm should always be the one to fight the fish, and your weak hand should be the one that usually cranks in. You should always be using your strong arm to leverage the fish. So the cool thing, like I was saying about the bait caster though, is you can cut your whole rig off, tie a quick fish on or a spoon and start casting this for salmon or steelhead or whatever. It's very versatile. Like this rod was specifically for a trip to Alaska, so I could fish with Vibrax spinners. I could jig with this rod, or I could also use a float rig. So that was designed specifically for that. So I would say it goes from a spinning reel to a bait caster and then onto a center pin. The whole goal is you're trying to do the same thing. You're just trying to slow your float down to present your bait first. That's what we're trying to do. So that's why a center pin is so nice. A lot more difficult to use. I shouldn't say that. It's a lot easier to use, it's just a little bit more difficult at first. So the most difficult part with the Centerpin is it's difficult to cast. So like, you know, there's so many resources out there now, being you know, YouTube and books and the internet. I mean, it's pretty easy to figure it out, and there's enough guys doing it nowadays that you can go up to somebody and ask them, and typically the guys will be nice enough to help you out. But the Centerpin makes it so nice because you're pretty much, your hand is right there the whole time. So as your float's drifting downriver and you're trying to slow it down, you're able just to touch it lightly with your finger and slow your float down, so your bait angles up to the fish first. And that makes it a lot easier than, you know, worrying about flipping a spool over and everything. It's a lot more intimate because there's no gear ratio, there's no drag, everything is just you and the fish on these Centerpins. So as you're drifting, you know, you're able to control it, and then as soon as your float goes down, you put your finger on it, set the hook, and you're into the fish. And then it's, you know, you can either fight the fish by palming the reel, which I don't recommend. I really suggest trying to fight the fish using your fingers up here. The same fingers you would control the speed of your float is what you want to do. You guys want to talk about different baits you can use under the float? Does that sound good? Any other questions? You want me to?
Beads.
Beads?
Yeah.
All right.
Single bead.
Single bead. So beads are one of probably the most effective non-natural baits you can use, I would say. I mean, they really, at first I almost kind of thought, you know, it was a snagging deal until I went to Alaska and really saw how they work. So there's a whole variety of different beads you can use. You can use soft plastics, there's hard plastics. I've been really into the soft plastic beads lately. So basically a bead imitates an egg. I mean, that's why it's really so effective. And there's a lot of different styles of beads out there. There's a hard plastic bead and a soft plastic bead, and all the different plastics do something different. So depending what that plastic is made out of, if it's acrylic or styrene, or if it's a sinking soft plastic or a floating soft plastic, that bead is going to do something different in the water, okay? So most of us are familiar with Trout Beads or Great Lakes Beads or one of those companies, and those are all made of acrylic or styrene, and they're going to be pretty much neutral buoyant. So they're not going to sink like a glass bead, but what they're going to do is they're going to pretty much almost act exactly like a normal salmon egg would act. It would be neutrally buoyant. So what I've been doing lately is, because the controversy with a hard bead is you're fishing an empty hook below it. You could fish a fly sometimes below it, which will work really good. But when you're fishing just an empty hook and they go for the bead, you pretty much have to time it just right of when you lift up on your rod. You're not even setting the hook, you're just kind of lifting up on it where you're trying to catch the fish right in the corner of the mouth when you're fishing a bead. And they shake the hook so many times that it's like you really got to pick the right hook and tie the right knot and everything to kind of dial it in just right. So all the bead fishing I've done, I would definitely say the most effective beads that I've used are soft plastic beads. Hope I got some examples for you guys here. I'm sure I do.
Hey Dan, quick question here. Do you use a slip bobber or a fixed bobber, and what situation?
Okay, so I'll pass these around. This is a soft plastic bead, a floating soft plastic, and I'll answer that question really quick. All right, so me personally, I'm a fixed float guy, and the reason I like a fixed float is because I'm able to present a more natural presentation, where I'm always able to stabilize my float very quickly. So I always stack the heaviest amount of lead right below my float, so when I cast out, the float automatically stabilizes and the rest of the rig kicks out in front of the bait, so the bait's already in the presentation mode as soon as I cast. And a lot of times when you're float fishing, you don't want to cast upriver from you, because by the time that your rig actually sets, to get the float to be angled downriver, you know, if you casted this upriver from you, this is going to be drifting like this, and what's going to happen? Your rig's going to be swinging the opposite direction, and you're going to be hitting the fish with all the split shot and your high vis line and everything else before the float gets there. So I always cast straight in front of me, mend my line, or I'll quarter cast down and just keep working my way down. Versus, you know, traditionally guys that are bottom bouncing, they typically cast out in front of them, keep their line tight, and kind of just bounce it down like this. Float fishing is the exact opposite. You kind of want to cast straight out in front of you and kind of just work it down, or kind of quarter cast it down, which is typically what I like to do a lot of times. So the fixed float versus a slip float. So there's, you know, most of the baits that I'm fishing, they're going to, they're not going to be pushing a ton of water. So what that means is they're a smaller presentation. I'm pretty much using anything from a 6mm bead, like the one I'm passing around, all the way to a 32nd ounce jig. So I mean, if you could figure, everything's either dime size, maybe up to quarter size. And what I mean by the amount of water it pushes is how high it rides in the water column. So for example, like let's just take this as a dime size egg sac. That's going to cut through the water a lot easier than a quarter size egg sac, meaning that the bigger the egg sac, the more water it's going to push, and the higher in the water column it's going to ride just because it's bigger. It's the same kind of idea of having the tapered shot where you want the point of least resistance down at the bottom. It's the same thing. The more resistance you have in the water, the higher it's going to ride up in the water column. So because I'm usually fishing a smaller presentation for steelhead, it's automatically going to be able to get my bait down naturally just by having, just by staggering my shot down like so. I'm able to present my bait first. And I'm typically, I can cast pretty good up to like 13 or 14 foot with a slip float. So the slip float's going to give you a more natural presentation when presenting smaller baits to steelhead. If you're salmon fishing, however, you're using typically a pretty big chunk of skein, and that really pushes a ton of water, and that's a situation where I'll use a slip float. And I'll show you guys that rig right now. So the salmon that I fish for in the lower Niagara, they're like their own animal. It's not like, you know, catching them in Bird Dam or somewhere where they're getting snagged all the time. I mean, those fish come in there really fresh. So this is typically the only time I will run a slip float is when I'm fishing somewhere really deep, like the Niagara, or if I'm fishing a harbor or something where I got to get down 20, 30 foot. And typically what I'll do is I'll try to create the same exact situation as what I have here, but I'm going to have a slip float in there to kind of gonna allow me to fish any depth I want. But I'm still having my heaviest point furthest up on my line, which is usually this inline sinker right here. And then I'm doing a tapered shot line all the way down. So I'm still getting this same presentation. I'm still holding back on my float, and it's still presenting the bait first, but it doesn't give you as natural as a presentation as if you're going to use a fixed float. And I would still use a fixed float for salmon if I was using smaller baits, but I typically will use, you know, a golf ball sized chunk of skein for these things. So the slip float really aids in that, because what happens is this big weight is going to stabilize your bait. This is like an inline trolling sinker, and typically what I do with these inline trolling sinkers is, this is a 40-gram float to fish in Niagara, so this is a 1 ounce inline weight, and then what I'll do is I'll make up that 40 grams, so I need to make up, let's see, 20, I need to make up 12 grams of weight. So if my inline weight's an ounce, I need to make up 12 grams of weight tapered down my shot line to balance the float out properly. So what I'll do is I'll just create that taper from heaviest to lightest. So what's going to end up happening is, I'll show you I'll kind of draw a slip float rig for you under the water so you can see how that works.
Now you're always using smooth sinkers, right?
Yeah, everything, nothing, you don't want anything with ears on it. That's going to create extra line twist under the water. And you know, the ears beat up your line pretty good. If you cast and you have your line wrap around each other, we're using 3 to 8 pound fluorocarbon for steelhead a lot of times, so those little ears sometimes can nick your line up pretty good. Mostly though, it causes a lot of line twist. And if you guys have been hearing me talking about the spinning reel and everything else, line twist is like an enemy in this world. Like, you want to stay away from it because it's going to take away from that natural presentation. As the line is coming off the reel, if it's hitting the blank as it's going down, it's creating friction, and everything is about a smooth, slow drift the whole entire time. So you don't want to have any line twist whatsoever. So if you're going to take the jump into getting into centerpin fishing, make sure you learn how to cast the right way with a Wallace or a BC cast or something where you're spinning the reel instead of casting off the side. So a slip float rig essentially looks like this under the water. And typically this would be like more like a steelhead rig, what I would use, and like let's say that this is 10 foot deep here. Okay, this rig would typically, if this was straight up and down, this would be pretty much 10 foot deep or 10.5 foot deep. And pretty much the fish are sitting just off the bottom. But like I said, what's so cool about this is, where's my bobber at? You could hit a fish that's sitting at 10 foot with this rig, or you could hit a fish that's at 7 foot. So the whole entire time, you know, holding back on your float, by the way, the actual term for that is actually called trotting your float. So as you're slowing the float down, that's called trotting. When you stop your float completely, when you pause it, and the bait will just rise below and you just stall it out during the drift, that's called checking your float. So you got trotting and checking are the two main techniques. And I catch more, I'd say 75% of my fish come on a check than anything else. So I'll be pretty much trotting my float the whole time. I'll pause it. The bait will rise up and it will cover somewhere else in the water column. So a fish that's sitting back here at 7 foot will see that 10 foot lead is just coming up a little bit. The bait's stalling there for a quick second, and the fish is coming over and grabbing it. So you're able to cover a lot of different depths of water just by slowing down how fast your float is drifting in the water column. So yeah, let me get back to the.
When you let that line drift, how long are you? I guess it depends on how many people are in the stream. Like, do you let out 500 feet of line, or you just keep it within a? Well,
I mean, depending. I mean, if your hole is pretty evenly, if the bottom is pretty flat like this, you could drift it until you can't see your float anymore. You know, a lot of places. But, you know, typically what you're going to have is you're going to have a scenario where the bottom is kind of coming up like this at the head of the hole. And it's going to get deep down here, and then it's going to come up again. So what's cool about that is you're able to put more pressure as it gets towards the rear of the hole, because sometimes in the wintertime the fish are going to be sitting in the tail outs where the water is the slowest. So the water is going to be the fastest here where it's shallower, where it's dumping into a hole. It's going to get deeper, it's going to be slower here. The water's still going to be cooking along the top here, if you guys can just envision this. Like, it's dumping into a hole, it's moving really fast, it's still moving fast kind of until you get to about right here. And then it starts to slow down a little bit. You know, your speed starts to die down a little bit. And then towards the end here, it's almost like flat water. You're not even really seeing much of like a riffle. And that's where, you know, you could kind of just balance out with how much pressure you're putting on your float with, you know, with your checking and your trotting. I mean, that's what it's all about at that point. But I want to draw a slip float rig under the water just to answer that one last question, and then I can move into something else. And typically, guys, like I'm not drawing this very good, but you want to balance your float out right to where it's usually marked, right to where that black line is. You don't want your float sitting too high up in the water like so, and you don't want it sitting too low. You kind of want it balanced just perfectly. So when the fish does grab that, they're not feeling a lot of resistance. It doesn't take a lot to pull the float down. So that's why you really want to balance your float just about perfectly.
You all know which way it's going.
Yeah.
You should ask.
So this would typically be like my slip float rig to fish for fish that are typically suspended. Like salmon, most of the time, they're not sitting like right at the bottom like steelhead are. They're more suspended up when they enter the rivers, typically when you're fishing in like harbors and the Niagara and stuff like that. So what I'll do is I'll pretty much start with my slip float, and I'll keep, actually I'll go over how I'll approach a hole in a second, but I want to show you guys kind of why I chose a slip float over a fixed float. So this is kind of my fixed float scenario. This is my slip float scenario. So what happens when I cast my slip float is I need to wait for my float, for this weight to sink all the way down, stabilize, let the bait kick out in front, and the float kind of slide up my line and hit my bobber stop. So I'm losing a lot of time of natural presentation, but I need that big heavy inline weight right here to keep this guy down there. So what's happening is this heavy weight is balancing this skein out right here. It's keeping it down in that current. and then the tapered line below the inline sinker, the tapered shot pattern is kicking the bait out in front of everything else, so it's presenting the bait first. Does anyone have any questions before I talk about what I do when I approach a hole first and how I'll read it? Anyone got anything else? Okay, well, so guys ask me all the time, how deep should I fish? That's like a very common thing with float fishing. Like, they don't know how to judge the depth they're gonna fish. So typically when I walk up to a run, I'll guesstimate. There's a couple different ways you could do it. There is something called a Plumb Bomb that you could actually clip to your hook. It's like a little clip with like a 1 ounce sinker on it or a 1/2 ounce sinker. And you could cast it and kind of find the bottom. When your float stops sinking, then you find the bottom, you can adjust it. I think it's a lot easier to go into a hole, kind of guesstimate where you are in the hole. If you start off at the head of the hole, start off at 3 foot or 4 foot or whatever you think that depth is, and don't leave that spot until you find bottom. Just constantly present that bait until you hit the bottom, and keep playing around with the float. Stall it, trot it, do whatever you need to do, and then you can also switch your bait, your sack color out. There's so many little things you can do to trigger strikes out. So what I typically do is I'll go into a spot, I'll kind of judge whatever I think the depth is. I'll set that depth, I'll cast out, I'll be drifting into a hole, and if I don't get a bite, I'm constantly moving my float up 3 or 6 inches every single time until I find bottom or until I get a bite. But once I get a bite at that certain depth, I'll keep fishing that, and then I won't leave that hole until I actually find bottom. So on a 18-foot hole, I'm constantly adjusting my float until I find bottom eventually. Any other questions? I can get back to the bead thing now too. Kind of getting all over the place. So there are a couple different types of beads. There's hard plastic beads and soft plastic beads. Like when I opened my shop 5 years ago, hard plastic beads were like all the rage. I have a whole entire section of just all different color hard plastic beads with a million different shades. And a lot of times that shade really makes a difference. Like I've changed from a light shade of white to a light shade of yellow and triggered a strike right away. So it's pretty ridiculous. You do need to have a good assortment of beads. Typically the two best ones are Glow Row and Chartreuse if you're going to just pick two. Anything peachy and natural and anything that kind of looks unnatural. And you want to have something that looks kind of like a washed up dead egg too in your whole selection. The issue I was having with the hard plastic beads though, because you're typically fishing a bare hook underneath it, is you're losing a ton of fish. So picking a hook is one of the most important things when rigging that. So you're trying to find something with a wide gap, super sharp with a straight eye. That's what I like. And then it's typically set up for a regular standard clinch knot or an advanced clinch knot. If you're going to go with something like an octopus hook, you got to make sure you use a knot that's going to match that hook, which if you use an octopus hook, you're going to have to snell that at that point, or use some sort of bait loop knot. So over the last couple years, there's been, with all these different, beads and everything else that have been coming out, there's been an introduction into soft plastic beads. So the problem you're having with the hard plastic beads is you have a real limited time from when the fish grabs that bead to get that hook in their mouth before they spit that bead back out, because they're going to grab it, they're going to bite down on it, and they're going to spit it out as soon as they feel it's hard. So you could help out by adding some scent to your beads and everything, and I'm like a huge scent guy. I add scent to everything except my natural row bags. Everything gets scent on it. My jigs, my beads, any spoons or anything I'm fishing underneath the float always will get some scent to it.
Whether it's steelhead or salmon or...
Yep, I just don't want my human scent on it, and I don't want, typically, I was showing you guys this package of beads here. You're gonna pull this out, and a lot of times, this stuff comes from, Washington and Oregon, and they have all these really interesting regulations, where you can't fish any scent, otherwise it's considered a bait at that point. So a lot of their products don't come scented because of that. So you'll see a lot of non-scented baits. So if you buy a pink rubber worm or something, sometimes they come shrimp scented, sometimes they just come plain, but a lot of times they're put in oil so that they don't stick together in the bag, and it's some sort of petroleum that these are made out of. So I'd rather have some sort of fish smell on it, even if it's herring oil. I typically like to use Smelly Jelly or something like that that's made out of salmon eggs or a blend of different scents.
Question for you, go-to hooks for beads. what would you recommend?
So the best hook on the market, you guys are gonna think I'm like this crazy Blood Run guy here, but definitely Blood Run has come out with a hook this year. It's a straight eye, it's a wide gap. It's pretty much shaped just like, it looks like a kind of a short standard fishing hook just with a wide gap. So what that wide gap allows is, if let me clear this off here. So let me first tell you why I like straight eyes over a crooked eye in one direction or another. So the reason why I think straight eye hooks are so good is because you can tie a clinch knot on it, okay? And it's like, well, a clinch knot's a pretty simple knot. It's also called a fisherman's knot. But the reason I like it more is because in this rig, you're doing essentially 3 knots on this whole entire rig. You got the knot that goes to your barrel swivel to your main line, which is always, your main line is always gonna be heavier than what your fluorocarbon's gonna be. That's something I should have went over, which I didn't. You're typically always gonna fish, your main line's always gonna be something from 8 to up to 20 pound, I would say. And you could always fish, you know, you could always fish fluorocarbon that's lighter than what your main line is. But you have to make sure that you don't really skip around from brand to brand too much, because what's gonna end up happening is if you buy 10-pound Sunline, which really breaks at 10 pound, and then you buy a 6-pound Trilene or a 6-pound Drennan, that Drennan's going to be snapping that 10-pound Sunline at all times. So the best thing to do is to do something like go with Blood Run floating mono, get a 15-pound or the 10-pound, and then you know, as long as you stay with their fluorocarbon in the ranges of, you know, the 3, 4, 5, 6, and 8, as long as you fish those, you know you're covered if you're fishing 10 to 15-pound mainline. So you got your main line and then you got your fluorocarbon. The main line is going to be that sectional line that's floating on the surface like I was talking about earlier. So back to hooks. So you got 3 standard knots that you're using, and I'm using a clinch knot for every single one of them. But the reason I like the clinch knot so much in connecting my leader to leader is because I could do more twist up near the swivel versus down near the hook. So for example, like, which is going to end up giving me a stronger knot near my barrel swivel versus my hook. So if I put 10 twists up and go through the bottom and then out through the top and cinch it down, and then I use 7, typically if I ever snag up on the bottom or break off, I'm breaking off right down here versus breaking off right up here. So that's why I typically like that knot the most, and I typically can angle it and get it straightest on my line versus other knots that I found. But so that's why I choose a straight eye wide gap hook, and I'll fish. That's a great hook for beads and eggs. And so our pretty much the most basic hooks we're going to use. This is like a straight eye. And then you want to find a wide gap, because obviously if you're not fishing any bait on that, the fish is like, you know, you're trying to get the most surface area when you're setting the hook to bury that hook into the fish's mouth when you're fishing a bead above it. I mean, are you guys familiar with bead fishing in here? Everybody? You know, you're not? Okay. So pretty much how the bead fishing works, because this isn't going to make sense unless you see it. You got your bead here. The line runs typically through your bead, and then you're fishing your hook usually about an inch below it. So this was developed in Alaska, so all the wild rainbow trout and stuff weren't ingesting, you know, like presentations that were directly on the hook. So what ends up happening is when you're fishing a bead above your hook, when they go for the bead and you set the hook, you're really grabbing them on the outside or just on the corner of the inside of the mouth. That's why the beads were developed in Alaska, to kind of protect the wild rainbow trout, because they're so aggressive. It's like a natural chum slick of dying salmon and flesh and eggs drifting down those rivers. It's not like, I mean, we do get that a little bit here, but not nearly as much as Alaska will have it.
What size hook do you use?
So typically what I like to do is I like to fish, like for an 8mm bead, I like to fish a size 8 hook or a 6. For a 10 millimeter bead, I like to fish an 8 or a 10, and I typically go a lot smaller than most people.
Yeah.
You know, you got to make sure it's the same kind of thing. You know, you got to kind of always in your head just think about what your bait is doing underneath the water. Like, that's the whole thing, is envision what everything is doing under the water. So when I'm picking my hook, like, I'll know guys that fish a size 2 with a size 8 millimeter bead, okay, because they want that gigantic surface area. When that fish goes for this bead, they want to have a lot more surface area to be able to hook the fish in the mouth.
But can't the hook spook the fish though? If it's too big.
And that's my thing too, because if you're presenting the bait to the fish first, the first thing the fish is actually going to see is the hook coming at them. But they're typically like, you know, I'm using a smaller hook, and it's usually like a black hook, so they're not seeing it really coming at them, and it doesn't seem to affect them that much, to be honest with you. But the whole reason I don't like using really big hooks with beads is I feel like it kind of dampers the action of the bead, more or less. So in some situations, if you're using like a really high buoyancy plastic, you know, that might not be a bad thing. It might be able to sink your bait down a little bit more for you. That may aid you, but it might hurt you too if you're using something that's already sinking real hard as it is. Question, sir?
You use double beads?
What type of beads?
You use 2 beads?
I do sometimes use it. It's a tandem rig. Sometimes I'll run 2 beads. So typically when I do that, it's mostly all Erie tribs, because a lot of the Ontario tribs, it's illegal to use a tandem rig. So I'm using most of them when I'm fishing in all the New York Erie tribs all the way through Pennsylvania and Ohio and stuff like that. And that does give you a good presentation. Typically what I like to do is I like to use a hard plastic bead above, and then what I'll do is I'll just tie off the bottom knot here, and then I'll just do another bead dropper here. And I'll have another bead presented right here. So you're running 2 presentations. And when I'm running a tandem rig like that, now when I want to kind of get back really quick to when I'm fishing a bead versus fishing an egg. When I'm fishing a bead, because I'm kind of like mentally, like, I'm worried about them seeing the hook, I'm not checking my float or trotting my float as heavy as if I was fishing an egg sack or something like a jig or something that they're gonna see that first rather than seeing the hook like with a bead. So I'll more or less run this with not as much resistance drifting down the river. So I'll give it more of a straight up and down. I still want the bait presented first, but I'm not going to put as much pressure as if I was running an egg sack or something like that. So anyways, back to the beads. In the last couple years, there's been a huge trend of fishing soft plastic beads. So you still want to rig them the exact same way. It's all about figuring out how to peg them on your line so they're not going to slide up and down. And the best thing that I found is pretty much running, I don't know if I got one rigged up here, is running a little tiny glass bead that you would find at a craft store or something like that. I could pass one of those around too. What you want to do is you want to loop one of those around your line, hook your soft plastic bead, slide it up and over that little glass bead, and you get kind of like a blood dot effect, which really makes it look super duper natural. And the other great thing about a soft plastic bead versus a hard plastic bead is you're able to change the colors of your bead without having to cut your line every time. Because if you're fishing beads, every time you want to cut your line, or every time you want to change the color, you have to cut your line, put another bead on, repeg the bead, cut both ends of the peg, and then keep going from there. So it gets kind of be a pain. So if you're running soft plastic beads, all you're doing is you're sliding them off the hook, putting a new one on and sliding it up and over the bead, and you can change your colors pretty quick and change your sizes pretty quick too, which is pretty important. So the other day I was fishing Burt Dam where the fish get a ton of pressure, and I was fishing 8mm beads, and I switched to a 6mm, and I got 5 fish right in a row just from going down from a 6 to an 8. And I suspect that's because most of the salmon were pretty much flushed out of there, and they were pretty much seeing all trout eggs at that point. So the 6mm bead really presented, looked more like a brown trout egg versus salmon egg. I think that's why it worked better. But not only that, I mean, steelhead are typically super duper aggressive. They'll bite the first thing that comes down past them unless they're pressured. Once you throw some pressure in there and you got some guys that are, slapping the hole really hard with fly line or walking through the hole, it will kind of disturb the whole entire layout of what the fish are doing. And if they've been caught and they've been zipping all around through the hole, they release different, scents and stuff in the water that shows shows that they're stressed out. So it really goes hand in hand with trying to present to them like the most natural as possible. So if you're disturbing one fish in the hole and it's releasing all kinds of scent that it's stressed out, you don't want there to be really bright line flashing around under the water, because then the fish are going to start putting two and two together. At least that's what I think. I've seen it firsthand quite a few times.
I think that's true.
What, going back, you said certain size hooks for certain size eggs, or beads?
Yeah, yeah.
What are those again?
So pretty much what I do is I run for a size 10 millimeter bead, I'm running a size an 8 or a size 10 if they're soft plastic. If they're soft plastic, 8 or 10, and then I'll go all the way down to a 6 sometimes. So really depending on what, see, I know the brands so intimately, so I know how much one brand sinks versus how much one brand floats. So I'll kind of base my hook size off that, but a general rule of thumb is I run an 8 and a 10 with a size 10, and I run a 6 and an 8 with a size 8 bead. And with a 6 millimeter bead, I'll typically run a 10 or a 12. And I'll pass this scent around. This is kind of like my favorite scent. This is Smelly Jelly. This is kind of what I use. They're just these little black top containers, or like a 1 ounce container. But I've taken 10 drifts right in a row with no scent, put the scent on, and next drift I've had a fish. So I'm pretty convinced over it. I don't know if you want to check this out, but it makes them hold on to that bead a couple seconds longer, so you're really able to get the hook into them. And that's like a salmon scent. So salmon egg scent, probably with like some herring or something in there. So what I try to do when I buy the scents is I try to buy something that will work good for jigs and beads. So like, you know, they come in a whole variety of scent. I usually like to do like salmon egg with herring or something like that to cover kind of all ends of the spectrum. And a lot of times you don't always have to match up the bait fish. Like in their biochemistry, in their brain, they're so used to eating shrimp and herring and all this stuff out of the ocean. These fish are transplanted here. A lot of these, like, I guess it's their olfactory senses. A lot of those senses are firing when they're smelling shrimp and different stuff like that. And I think that's why salt also works so good here in the Great Lakes. We don't have any salt, but when the fish enter into the creeks, they seem to really fire on a lot of the cures that have salt in them, and a lot of the different and then just when you're just salting your eggs just to preserve them, it seems to work a lot better.
I don't see that in my neck of the woods, but I've had the same success with like power bait. You just take the dough and just rub it in, and then strip off the excess, and it hangs with the lure for, you know, whatever you're using. It'll hang there forever.
Oh yeah, and then like, you know, you kind of want to, like, that's an oil-based scent, and then if you're, you know, you want to be real careful if you're fishing jigs and flies that are supposed to have a lot of movement to them. You could really damper the action of that lure if that gets on the marabou feathers or the rabbit strips or whatever. So you really just want to put it on the head of the fly or the jig head, so it doesn't get on the part of the marabou or the rabbit strip that's supposed to have a lot of that movement and swim a lot. Beads, you don't have to worry about it. Beads are just, you know, looking like an egg, and they're just pushing water a certain way. So the beads are kind of cool because they push water. A 6 millimeter pushes water completely different than a 10 millimeter pushes water. And I think if, you know, I've seen this in many situations where fish have been in, you know, really, really muddy water, and there'll be a salmon that's spawning and ahead of them, and they're sitting there, or there's dead salmon around, they're sitting there picking off all these little salmon eggs, and I'm sitting there thinking, oh my God, the water's dirty, I gotta run really big bait. So I'm fishing really big bait to these fish, not getting anything, and then I end up putting them on a little tiny 8 millimeter bead and drifting it through this muddy water, and all of a sudden I'll hit a really fresh fish, I'll bring them in, it's puking up eggs. And what it was, I was just matching the way that bead matched the way that those eggs were pushing water moving down the river. So that's why that was so effective for me in that particular situation. But every situation is going to be a little bit different, you know, and you got to kind of pick the best bait for that. But there's pretty much, you know, in my arsenal, I pretty much have marabou jigs, I got egg sacs, and I got soft plastic beads, and then a few soft plastics like pink rubber worms, Berkeley gulp minnows. There's some other soft plastics I really like. But so yeah, let me get back to the hooks because I'm kind of all over the place here. Any other questions while I'm drawing it though? Wondering anything else?
Length of rod. I know these things are probably 13 years.
Yeah, I kind of went over that in the beginning. So like, you know, it's really, you're trying to control your float as it's drifting down. So the longer the rod, the better it is to control your float as it's drifting down the water. The one thing I notice is once you hit 14 foot, you start to lose the ability to control the rod, where you're gaining the ability to control the float. So it's more difficult, in other words, it's more difficult to wield around a 15-foot rod where you're going to be able to, you're almost starting to lose control of the float because you have so much rod to worry about, okay? So like, it almost seems to cut off right at 14 foot is where I think, for me preferably, that's where I think the cutoff is. But
What would you say would be like the minimum, like a 12?
I would say a minimum, like I've been seeing guys go shorter. A standard has always been like, you want to start off at it, you know, you don't want to go any shorter than 11 foot and you don't want to go any longer than a 15. I've seen guys use 17-foot rods. I've seen guys use 9-foot rods in some ditches and stuff like that. Really what you want to do is you want to match the creek you're fishing, and that's why, you know, this is a good excuse to your wife for walking out with a fishing rod, you know, every once a month. But, you know, every single creek you fish is going to kind of require a different rod. The bigger the water, the longer the rod you want, up until you hit 14 foot. I'm not really into those big long rods. I've been fishing a lot of 11 to 12.5-foot rods, like prototypes and stuff like that, and I've been liking the rod a little bit more in that length because I'm able to control it a lot better. So, you know, you're pretty much, the whole time you're staying in connection with your float, and it's not, there's this whole idea that you're keeping your rod up here the whole time as you're drifting, and that long length is going to aid in staying connected to your float, where what I do is I pretty much drop my rod down tip closer to the water, and I'm pretty much mending my line back and forth and kind of putting pressure on and just lightly lifting my rod up to control my float versus just keeping high up and just barely touching the spool with my finger as it's drifting down. Because if you're up here and your bobber goes down, you have really nowhere to set the hook. You're already back here, right? But if you're down closer to the water and you're drifting and you're controlling your float, kind of moving it back and forth, pulling it in and out of the seams, if you're all the way down here, you got all this to move back on versus already being up top here. So a lot of guys see me and the comments they always make is, oh my God, I can't believe how close you put your rod tip to the water. And they always say that I'm really checking my float a lot in comparison to what they typically have done.
Average leader length.
Arm length is what I always do, unless you're using a high-vis line. So if you're running a high-vis line, typically what you want to do, in the clearer the water, the more leader you want to use. So if I'm fishing the Niagara and it's got 15 foot of visibility, what I'll typically do is I'll run maybe a 3-foot leader, but typically I'm running an arm length leader, which ends up being around 24 inches, I would say 25 inches if I'm right, but I pretty much have a whole thing. I do arm length leader. I put 2 split shots on my leader right when I do it. I put usually, that's my barrel, so I usually put one here and one there. And a lot of guys will tell you not to put any shot on your leader because it will dampen the natural presentation of your bait. But a lot of times what you can do is you could fish the same exact rig all the way down here and just adjust these 2 little split shots on your leader line to give your bait the presentation you want. So if you want your bait to drop in faster at the head of the hole, what you do is you move your split shots down a little bit closer to the bait and you're able to fish that same depth just by, you know, slowing your float down and checking your float as it's going down the river and trotting it. So as it gets further back in the hole, what I'm doing is I'm moving these 2 split shots further and further up as I'm getting towards the back because there's less flow when I get towards the back of the hole. So I don't want these 2 split shots dampening the action of my bait. So what I do is I move them closer to my barrel swivel where my main line to my leader is connected. Does that answer your question there, Greg? All right, so typically if you're running a straight eye hook, what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to run a clinch knot, and that's your typical regular fisherman's knot where you wrap it 6 or 7 up to 10 times, go through the bottom, tighten it. At an advanced clinch knot is you're just going through the bottom, then you're going back up through the loop you already made. If you're running an octopus hook, which is an outward eye, kind of looks like this here. And this is kind of like my preferred my skein hook is. This is what I like to use. The reason I like to use that is I can create a loop based off my knot to hold the skein on it. So that's why I choose this. You can't use a clinch knot on these octopus hooks because what ends up happening is if you tie a knot, a straight knot off of it, you're going to be pulling the hook out of the fish's mouth because that's where the knot's going to end up. If you run a snell knot on these, the line's going to be wrapped all the way up and then it's going to go out and through the eye like this. So you're going to maintain good pressure and an upward pressure on the top of their mouth the whole entire time. You can't run a clinch knot on an octopus hook and have the same sort of success landing fish. You know, you got to pick the right knot. And then the last hook I really see a lot of people use is kind of an inward eye, which is called a caddis hook or a shrimp hook. And this hook, again, I see, you could kind of go both ways with this hook. I don't fish a lot of these hooks, these shrimp hooks or caddis hook. But the whole idea behind this hook is that when you bury it into the fish's mouth, it has to get all the way past that eye for it to unhook itself. So you're supposed to, once you set the hook and you bury the hook in the fish's mouth, it's supposed to stay more secure longer. But I typically, like I said, I like the straight eye for all applications except skein fishing, because with these different snells and bait loops and stuff like that, I'm able to slide my knot down. I'm able to hook my skein, bring this line behind, and wrap it around the skein here and tighten it up. So when I do a big, long, giant cast, I'm not casting all my skein off the hook the whole time. And skein's tough to get and it's expensive in the early season, so you definitely want to learn how to use that knot. Any other questions, guys?
What kind of split shots do you use? What brand?
So I think anything round that's real lead, that you don't want it too soft because then it slides up and down your line uncontrollably, and then you don't want something that's too hard because then you can't move it at all. So Sure Shot makes probably my favorite split shot. Unfortunately, it's weird. You're allowed to legally fish lead in New York, but you can't buy it, which is bizarre to me. But something with a waterfowl, they think that it's gonna help, but I really think Sure Shot's probably your best brand out of anything. I think Water Gremlin's also pretty good too, believe it or not. It's weird because
don't them ones have like the ears on them?
No, you could find straight round Water Gremlin. So just make sure you don't get anything with ears on it. That's gonna totally, as you got to figure, as you're putting pressure on your line, if you have anything that isn't round, it's just going to spin this whole entire rig. So this little barrel swivel that's in here, where you're connecting your leader to your main line, that will help kind of aid in when there's when your bait's spinning, when you're holding it back and your egg sack's spinning or something, that will take a little bit of the spin out, a little bit of the twist out of your line. But it's not a ball bearing swivel. It's not meant to spin. It's meant for a knot-to-knot connection. So you don't have to do, tie two different lines together is really what it's made for. So I see a lot of guys, what they do is they'll put a barrel swivel above their float, which totally kills this whole entire rig, because now you're not able to adjust your rig up and down. You got that barrel swivel stopping. So in that odd case, you go into a spot where you need to fish a 12-foot hole, and you have a barrel swivel above your float. Now what do? You can't move. Even if you get your float past that barrel swivel, you can't get your lead past that barrel swivel. Which ends up happening is you're not going to have this nice balanced presentation where you're able to present the bait first to the fish. It's not going to settle as easy for you. Any other questions?
Because you can't remove your lead.
Yeah,
so even
exactly.
if you reach in your bobber above your swivel.
Yeah, the lead's still staying down below. You don't have that lead to balance it out. So, I'm trying to think of what else I can tell you guys about. I could show you some different shot patterns. Actually, all the shot patterns, it's cool. I got it this year. Everything I talked about last year are on the back of that flyer, all the different shot patterns you have. So, there's 4 or 5 different ones I typically use, but everything, as long as you're running, like I said, the heaviest underneath, typically right underneath your float, I'm typically running 2 to 3 heavy split shots, and I'm tapering it down from there.
Are you ever using the shot or one time on? That's it.
No, actually, the split shot, you know, it's round, so it's like, you know, what do you do? Some of them you actually can find like a double cut split shot, like the anchor stuff. I mean, that stuff's all right, but I find it's a little soft.
You can't reopen them.
There is one tool that, the only tool I've been able to find that actually works like it should. There is one split shot removing tool, and it's right here. It's actually made by Centerpin Angling, and it's actually, it's kind of neat. I'll pass it around, but it's actually got like, it's actually got a small little knife on the one side. It's got scissors, it's got hemostats, and then it's actually got a split shot removing tool. And I've tried to modify all kinds of split ring pliers and everything like that. These are ridiculous. They're over 20 bucks, and I'm sure they're made in Pakistan or China or something for like $1. And you know, but they're well worth the 20 bucks. I mean, I save so much shot and everything like that. But more or less, it's more important where what's so cool about rigging your, you know, this is the other reason why I like a fixed float over a slip float. If I'm going to fish the Cattaraugus that's flowing at 600 or 800 cubic feet per second, and I'm going to go fish a small ditch, what I'm able to do is I'm able just to take a couple split shots off up here, and I'm able to put on a smaller float, which a slip float, you're going to have to cut your whole rig and redo the whole thing. I'm able to change my float around really quick and easy, and then I'm using this little tool here just to take my couple bigger split shots off right underneath the float, and then I'm able to match the gram float to go fish a smaller ditch or, you know, a mid-sized creek.
You mentioned just then, like, the Cattaraugus flowing at 600 feet per second or whatever.
Yeah.
Do you pay attention to that prior to, you know, like, do you check the internet and say, okay,
Yeah, absolutely, 100%.
That
I
makes
mean,
a difference of how you rig up and all this stuff right away. Like,
Yeah.
Anyway.
yeah, absolutely, and it's going to make even more of a difference. It's going to make a difference on what bait I'm going to bring with me. You know, how big a sacks I'm going to tie, what color sacks I'm going to tie. If I'm going to put any contrast colors in with my egg sacks, you know, that's what's going to make the big difference.
So that's more of a learning curve type thing?
No, I mean, I would say, you know, more importantly than flow is turbidity, which is water clarity. That outweighs flow 10 to 1. So how clear the water is going to differ from, you know, how much it's flowing. Because I'll fish the Cattaraugus at 2,000 CFS if it's got a foot of visibility. You just have to pretty much pick where the fish are not using the most energy to sit in one spot. So a lot of times I'll fish in spots where I'm typically standing when the water's at 200 CFS. That's where I'm actually drifting. And I know right where it is because I've already walked through there. So it's hard to fish higher water. You kind of just break it down in a small little section. You just, you know, if you kind of follow that rule where you get in there, you judge kind of how deep it is, and you kind of just fish until you hit bottom. And I forgot to mention this. I'm going to pass this tool around really quick so everybody can see it. This is a split shot remover. So what's going to happen when you're drifting your float, kind of how you're able to figure out like the depth and everything like that, and what's going on underneath the water, is looking at your float. So if your float's moving along like this, okay, and then your float stops like this, it stands straight up and down, and then it lays downriver and it drops, that means that you're snagged on the bottom. That means that this straightened out, you got hooked down here, and then your bobber sunk like this. If it's drifting like this and all of a sudden it shoots straight down, then it's a fish, then you know to lift up. But if it stalls, if it goes downriver and then drops slowly this way, then you know you're on the bottom. So then all you could typically do a lot of times is I typically just lift off, and then I know I have to apply a little bit more pressure. That's all I have to do. It's pretty simple. But just by looking at my float, I can tell everything that's going on underneath that water just by looking at what it's doing. So if it's drifting down and I'm constantly getting those, I'm almost able to just bottom bounce. You know, I'm able to just let the sack hit the bottom, and I'm just keep pulling it off the bottom. So as the float's drifting down, it's going like this. It's laying down, it's angling like this, and I know right before it drops down, I just need to just lift my rod up a little bit and let the drift keep continuing, and I just need to apply a little bit more pressure to my reel as the line's flowing out. So that's one thing to look for. Reading your float is everything. Once you learn how to read what your float's doing, you're able to control so much. You're able to stop it before you're getting into a deep snag. You're able to hook a fish right when it bites. You're able to do a lot more with it. In different baits, you want to set the hook differently. Like I was kind of talking about a bead before. you know, a lot of times you think you want to be right on. As soon as your float drops, you're going to want to set the hook right away. With a bead, I'm kind of just lifting up. And with the way that the rods are designed nowadays, they're so fast action that you don't need to put a lot of force into it. Just a snap of a wrist and you're into them. But with a bead, I'm pretty much just lifting up and I'm connecting to them because they suck the bead in. As they're spitting the bead out, by that time, I'm just lifting up into them. I'm always hooking them in the corner of the mouth. And I keep trying to get to this point, but the soft plastic beads, I end up going to, let's say, an 80% landing ratio versus a hard plastic bead where I'm only going to a 40 to 50% landing ratio because they're able to shake that bead and they're not holding onto that bead for that extra second because it's not as soft. So that soft plastic, they grab onto it, it feels more natural, and they're giving you that extra second you need to bury the hook inside their mouth.
What about float shapes?
Float shape, that was great. I have all this stuff in my head and then I forget, so I'm glad you brought that up. So there's a bunch of different float shapes that are out there, okay? So like if there was one float, if you're gonna ask me to give you one float to use all the time, it'd be a loafer, okay? This is a typical loafer, and a loafer is just kind of a long, skinny float, and they hold a lot of weight. I mean, this is an 8-gram float. It's pretty incredible. This whole thing holds 8 grams, but I like this float because when you're trotting it, it cuts through the water and it's good in shallow or deep water. It's kind of a good all-around float. It also is good for jigging. You know, I can go use a jig because when I jig this, if you jig this float on top of the water, you're going to move a lot more water versus this float. So when you jig this, it's not going to push as much surface water versus this big giant thing that you're going to move a lot of water on the surface. So I like this. If I was going to stick with one standard float, if you're going to ask me to pick one, I'd pick this. If I was going to be fishing where I'm casting up towards me, where I'm like fishing at a discharge situation or a waterfall or something, I'm going to want my float to I'm going to want some sort of a stem float, okay? So in that situation, I want something like an Avon that has like a long stem. And there's a lot of custom float makers out there that will actually, they'll make this out of a steel, or they'll wrap it in copper or lead or something that actually will pre-weight the float for them so you don't have to bulk the shot right underneath it, and it will also get this float to settle as you're casting upriver. So why I kind of like these is if you're casting up forward, these are settling, you're kind of able to keep them kind of straight, because if you're fishing up and the water's coming towards you, you can't get this optimal presentation where it's drifting, where your bait's kind of leading the way. But this is the closest way to get to that, is running an Avon. That's the best way to do that. So pretty much for a really short, shallow situation, it would pretty much be this identical float here, but without this long, giant stem on it. Would be for like a fast, shallow riffle, because if you're fishing 2 foot down and you have 7 or 8 inches, you're already like a quarter of the way into the hole. So one of these, this is only taking up about an inch or two going down the water. So and you're not really concerned about how much surface current you're moving, because it's not slow water. So for shallow, fast, I usually like these smaller teardrop ones that are gonna, they hold about the same amount of weight, but they tend not to sit as deep in the water, and I'm able to control them a little better because they're wider. Once I get to a slower, deeper pool, then I want something that's going to cut through the water and not disturb the surface like a loafer. So I'd say if you want 2 good overall floats, you go with the loafer style or a classic like Avon style stem float, or a loafer. That's going to be your 2 best. But I don't change my floats too often while I'm out there. I'll pretty much have a loafer rigged up the whole entire time, because that's what I'm able to do the most with. And to be honest, there's not a matching float that I'm able to match the same top to this float and go over to a different style. So that's why I typically keep these rigged up the whole entire time. Anything else you guys want to know?
That was going to be my question, because you're putting on the little rubber stoppers
Yeah,
on the other ones. So
the silicone tubing. So like, this one actually takes a bigger piece of silicone than like a lot of the stem floats. So You know, like this float here, this takes the same silicone tubing at the top and bottom, and it goes pretty much for all the different brands. Where Drennan's, for example, which is one of the best floats out there for soft plastics, you know, you have such a wider top. So a lot of times you're figuring out how to slide this little piece of rubber tubing past all your split shots or sliding it down off of it. You're going to have to account for running extra pieces of little silicone tubing and stuff like that if you do want to switch, where you can just cut the bigger piece off. So I pretty much just stick to using one style float the whole time. But I'll tell you that the easiest thing to do is pretty much just go with a stem float like this, because it seems like all the manufacturers nowadays, they're all kind of using a standardized top and bottom tubing. They're just using that clear plastic surgical tubing that's nice and soft. And that's fitting all the different models of floats that are out there.
So you can change your weight simply.
You could change your style, you could change your weight and everything else really simply. So, anything else, guys? You want to talk about any baits, any jigs? You want to?
Color beads with muddy water.
So, like I was saying, it's really interesting. Like that day I was describing where there was like zero visibility, and I was fishing really big egg sacs. I went to a small little bead. I was running, I think I went to a chartreuse at first because I figured it's dirty water, they need some high vis.
Right.
And then I went like chartreuse and then a glow row, and I picked up a couple fish on those, and I really started killing them when I went to like a dead egg pattern, like something that looked like a milked out egg. So something that was like kind of like a, almost like a whitish peach color.
Right.
So like I would say, you want to have something that's really, really unnatural and bright for like really low light conditions like chartreuse or like a really bright pink. You're going to want something that's really natural if the fish are, you know, if they're seeing natural fresh eggs coming down. And then you're going to want something where once the fish have already spawned, there's eggs in the system, there's eggs floating around, you're going to want kind of like a dead egg look, like a washed out egg. So you're going to want something really bright and unnatural, something really super duper natural, and something that looks like a washed out egg. And then you'll have all your bases covered. You could kind of fill in the gaps. You could pretty much pick 6 beads that will cover you for everything. But like I said though, the soft plastic eggs, I have them over at my booth. They're by far, I've caught way more fish on those. I get a lot more bites on the soft plastic versus the hard plastic. I'll see if I can find some of those really quick. And kind of when I'm rigged up, guys, I mean, this is typically, you know, this is one of like 4 set of waders, but I kind of keep everything that I'm using regularly up front really easy to get to. So I got my fluorocarbon up front right here. I got my terminal tackle box. I got like a small box of jigs. But mostly what I'm going to be going through the most is the couple little split shots on my leader line. And I'm going to be going through hooks and fluorocarbon. So as long as all that stuff's right up front, it's super easy to get to. It's all really accessible. I really suggest buying a terminal tackle box that you can put all your different hooks in, your shot, your float tubing, everything just like that, so it's right here in front. And then I'll have my bag where I keep like a bigger assortment of jigs. I keep my floats because you're really not changing your float that much. I mean, I carry a ridiculous amount of floats, but I really don't need that much. I typically keep a bigger box of, you know, jigs if they start getting really super duper picky, but I pretty much have 4 or 5 jigs, you know, at the front of my chest the whole time, that if they're not going to bite one of those, I'm probably going to move on to another spot. But I pretty much, if I go through a hole and I fish jigs and an egg through and I don't get anything, I'm going to go down to a next spot. And there's kind of 2 ways to approach creek fishing. You can either cover the most amount of water and pick up the aggressive fish before somebody else gets to it, or you just keep breaking down that hole and just keep fishing for this fish that are already there and just try to present them something that they haven't seen in a more natural manner, more or less. And then I always have a backup box in case I drop that one. My day isn't over, so I always keep a backup one of those. Hate to end the day on that. And I typically will just keep my bait like in these little side containers in a bottle of water. And I always take 2 extra pairs of hemostats because you lose these and that's a big issue too. And then those split shot removers. You guys got any other questions?
Bottom contact, like all the time. I mean, would you fish at the bottom first, or let's say you came up to the hole, you haven't fished yet, and let's say 10 feet, 12 feet deep. You start out high or you start out low?
So typically what I'm going to do is, I always want to start higher to answer, to short answer that is I'll start high and then I'll just keep working down to where the fish are, because you know, you might have some fish that are suspended. There's always, with steelhead, there's always seems to be an alpha fish in every hole. It's usually like a big male that's kind of like in there just pushing all the other fish around. There's always an alpha fish in a hole, it seems like. So that's usually going to be the first fish that's going to strike. And that guy, you can catch him in a 12-foot hole. You could catch him 6 foot down. So you can go up to a hole, you know, guess it's 10 foot, it's really 12 foot. You start at 6 feet, cast out, get a fish. You'd be like, all right, I'm dialed into him. I know I need to be fishing 6 foot. And then you keep drifting, you don't get anything, and then you move on to the next spot. Well, if you don't get all the way down to that 12-foot bottom, then you're not covering. There's probably a bunch more fish sitting below that guy that you missed, that you passed up because you didn't sit there and constantly adjust. But what I'll do is when I walk into a hole, I'll always kind of start, because the holes usually start, they're shallow in the front, and then they get deeper, and then they shallow up at the tail out. So I'll always start a little bit more shallow at the front, at the middle of the hole. I'm making adjustments the whole time, by the way, too. Like when I'm in a hole, I'm adjusting my float like probably 10 times in every single spot to make sure I'm covering each seam and the whole entire hole effectively. And a lot of times there's in the Great Lakes, we have so many slate ledges and stuff like that the fish are sitting in between the slate cuts and all that. So you could be fishing 10 foot down and there could be a slate cut where there's a bunch of fish piled in at 6 foot, and you just lift it up off that slate. And now you trot your float and you're fishing six feet, and a fish comes up and grabs it. And if you can recognize that if the water's clear enough and you can make that adjustment when you're drifting over that spot, you're not dragging that 10-foot lead, and you're able to drift that 6-foot lead over to where that pocket of fish are, you're able to, you know, fish those fish effectively. But I pretty much always start at the top of the hole. I start a little bit shallower, and I make sure I come in contact with the hole at the top of the hole. At the midsection of the pool, I'm always finding bottom, and at the tail out, I'm always finding bottom. But I'm always checking my float the whole time and trotting it the whole way down. And I'm adjusting it 3 to 6 inches every single drift. And I'm changing my baits out too. I'll typically start off with a really bright egg sac of some sort, and then I'll start going to more muted colors. Like I'll go to a pink, I'll go to a peach, I'll go to a white, and then I'll try something like a purple or a blue or something to see if they've already been shown the pinks and the chartreuses and stuff like that.
Your soft beads, are you slide them past the hook, just like?
Yeah, they're just like a regular bead. And
You don't leave them down by the hook?
No, you don't. No, I don't leave them down by the hook. And it's, you know, the main difference between our fish and I think you could fish them on the hook. For some reason, I've tried fishing them both ways. They seem to fish better above the hook, like a normal bead. And you know, the whole thing too is that little glass bead that you're putting inside, pegged above there. You're sliding it up and over. I really wish I had one rigged up here. That bead that you're sliding up and over, that glass bead, you get such an awesome blood dot looking egg. It's hard for those fish to refuse. And typically the brands that I'm using, that little glass bead helps that bead sink down a little bit more and stay in the strike zone a little bit better. The soft plastics don't sink as good as they should. There's only one brand that makes a sinking soft plastic egg. All the rest of them are either neutral, buoyant, or they float. And you kind of want to stay away from that with the float fishing. You just want to try to get something that's going to be like a slow sinking, or like a really something that's like a neutral buoyant, but that's on the lower end of neutral buoyancy. That's going to be like sinking a little bit more.
Can you run a bead as a trailer to something like a jig or fly? Did you just cover
Yeah, that's called a candy dropper. So like the problem, you could run actually I really like fishing this a lot. It's kind of like it's kind of an interesting rig, because what you could do is you could run this same exact tandem rig like I got here, but you could run a jig below it. So like for example, instead of a bead right below a bead, you could run a marabou jig below there. And now what's so cool about that, which I like about this whole rig, is that when you're drifting down, the first thing the fish is seeing, instead of a bare hook, they're seeing a jig or something. And it's also, they're seeing they're seeing something looking up at an egg. So you have your egg presentation with your bead, and you have a minnow or a bug or a crayfish presentation with your jig. So these fish are, you know, not only are they in there to eat inside and spawn and everything like that, but they also want to protect anything that's in there that's going to jeopardize their young. So if there's another fish inside the creek that's feeding on their eggs, they're going to want to hit it and kill it. So when you set up a presentation like this where you have a bead, a hook, and then you have a jig, what ends up happening is when you're drifting that down, it's looking like there's a minnow that's coming up and getting ready to grab an egg. So you're almost having a 2 different part presentation underneath that float. So it really is super effective, especially when the fish are spawning. When there's a lot of spawning fish around, adding a jig in that whole process works really super good. Especially if you match like your jig head color right here to whatever the bead color is here. It looks like there's a jig that's getting it looks like there's a minnow or something that's sucking on an egg, and you have a bead that's the same color as whatever color jig head you have, and now it looks like a really natural presentation coming down. The fish are super duper snappy on that. Anything else, guys? Got a time here?
In that illustration again,
11:23.
has a soft egg with a hook below it.
So the soft egg I really like to run below the hard egg, because the soft egg.
There's 2 eggs on there. Okay, kind of this type first.
Yeah, no, this one was like a tandem rig. So like someone asked, like, couldn't you run 2 beads? So like, yeah, you can. So I'll always typically what I'll do is I'll run a hard bead up here, because if you run a soft plastic bead, what ends up happening with soft plastic beads, which is kind of the only downfall to them, is that after they've been hit a few times, they tend to want to slide down to your hook on a hook set a lot of times. So what happens is you want to change it or rehook it in a different area. So you kind of quarter hook them so you have 4 different spots to hook a soft plastic bead. Where when you're fishing a hard plastic egg, what ends up happening is it's running through the center and you're pegging it, so the bead isn't affected whatsoever. So I'll always fish, if I'm going to fish 2 beads, I'll always fish a hard plastic bead at the top and then a soft plastic bead at the bottom. So the soft plastic bead will go here, and this way I'm able to change the color of the soft plastic bead, and I'm always able to change it if it gets too beat up, because I couldn't get it past all this other stuff if I ran a soft plastic bead up here.
And it's tied directly under the hook.
Yeah, that's tied right at the bend of the hook.
And
It's just like a 6 to 8 inch dropper.
What knot are you using?
Just a regular clinch knot. Everything in this whole program is all advanced clinch knots all the way down. And like I said, you know, the reason I picked that knot is, you know, at my barrel swivel, which is right here connecting my leader, I'm able to put 10 twists in there, 7 twists in here. So ideally, if everything on my leader, if I have no nicks or anything like that, and the split shot didn't jeopardize the strength of the leader, it will always break here because I have less twists. It's ideally a stronger knot up top here because I put more twist in that knot. You always want to make sure with a fluorocarbon, because heat's like fluorocarbon's enemy, you want to make sure you really wet that with a lot of spit before you slide those knots down. You have to kind of be careful when you're tying them. And you know, that also brings me to, like, when you're picking out your fluorocarbon, you want to make sure you pick something that's like going to have a lot of bait movement. It's not going to be too stiff, and it's going to be abrasion resistant. Because if you buy something like, you know, Drennan, once you get past a 5-pound Drennan, you're getting, your bait it doesn't have enough natural movement. It's just so super stiff. So what you're trying to do is you're trying to find kind of something that's going to hold up to running against rocks and fish, you know, hitting you on, you know, slate shelves and stuff like that, but also still give you a nice natural presentation with your bait. So a really good happy medium is, like I said, the blood run fluorocarbon is the best in the industry right now as far as fluorocarbon goes, and mainline. So I definitely say a nice, simple, easy thing to do is get your reel filled up with 10 or 15 pound fluorocarbon or mainline, and then run like anywhere from 4 to 8 pound fluorocarbon. You'll be covered for all our stream situations locally.
What bead pegs?
What bead pegs? So there's
Use different colors?
so
separate?
I sell more clear than anything, but I'm all about contrast. So I typically like a light pink. Like I like getting a blood dot appearance on all my beads. So like if you're running a chartreuse bead, I'll typically run a pink peg in it to give it kind of like a blood dot appearance. But I sell more clear than anything at the shop. So I would say clear is by far the most popular. Me personally, I like pink or red.
Jig sizes.
Jig sizes, okay, so jigs, one of my favorite baits to use. The slower the water, the smaller the jig head. So if you're fishing the Niagara, you can get away with running a 1/16 ounce, but I don't ever go above a 1/16 ounce. Again, without getting too confusing, the more material that's on a jig, the more water, the more buoyant it's going to be. So you can actually tie a ton of material on a 1/16 ounce jig head, and it's going to act the same exact way in current as a 32nd ounce jig head with less material on it. So the more material on your jig head, the slower it's going to sink, because all that material has to get pushed down with that jig. Typically what I run though in any sort of harbor situations or like low current situations near like mouths of rivers and creeks is I'll run anything like a 1/80th ounce to a 1/64th ounce jig. And then once I get into areas with some current, I like 32nd and 64th ounce jigs. And then sometimes I'll go, like I said, do a 1/16th of an ounce if I have to. If I'm fishing out west in Oregon or Washington, and I'm fishing a pink worm on a jig head, I can go up to a 1/4 ounce. But that's a whole nother thing that you guys won't really be into right now, since this is beginner flow fishing. But anything else?
Quick question on the hard bead on top, soft bead on the bottom. Are they still 2 fingers up from the hook, both of them?
Yes. Yep. Still 2 fingers up. Like 1 inch to 1.5 inches away. And I think 2 inches is like the law, where you're not supposed to go any further than 2 inches is what's in the reg book. 3 inches it is? Yeah. Yeah, no, I've never seen a DEC come down with a tape measure, but it was funny. My buddy got a ticket for running that rig in November or December in the Erie tribs like 4 or 5 years ago, and then in January they made it legal. So it's just crazy. But anywhere that there isn't like big, huge salmon, it seems like you're allowed to run tandem rigs. So most of all the Erie tribs I know of, I'm not too familiar with the Michigan rules, but all the Erie tribs all the way up through PA and Ohio, you're allowed to run the tandem rigs. Any other questions, guys? Got a time here?
I think we got a.
Oh my god, that's an hour and a half already. Wow. Well, thank you guys so much. I really appreciate it. And if you have any more questions, come by my booth too. I can show you close up.
Can I take a look at the way you guys
Oh yeah, sure. Yeah, this would be a good. My best rigs probably is the one we'll look at.
It is.
This is my typical like.
Yeah, we're gonna do one.
Yep. I'm running a 40. Yeah. So like really like I can get away with like a 25 grammer like some of the slower spots. But like this specific rig was to fish